by the UN. So the way things are shaping up now, it seems quite clear, actually quite clear, that there was pre-planning of the assassination.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Russell, for coming. After that BS last night, the sleep don't didn't go so great. Well, actually, this is beginning to look like it's going to work out well for Bernie and very poorly for Senator Warren. The whole progressive internet is up in arms after her today, and she and CNN are just getting the brunt of a total Twitter explosion. It's just fantastic. Okay, the reaction. So let's get into the recap. Okay, Okay, let me get into the recap now. Okay, what I'm going to do is to go over the individual performances first, and then I'm going to come to the summary. Maybe I shouldn't talk about the individual performances so much, but I'm going to go through the contributions of each of the individuals as I saw them from my standpoint. Now, what is my standpoint? Well, I think you know what it is. It has to do with the needs of the time, the need to overcome our neoliberalism, the need to save ourselves from the climate emergency, also the need to have a society which is a just one and a transition, which is a just one, which of course includes front and center a Medicare for All program. And you also know that from my point of view, austerity is not a real worry. No, I should say fiscal austerity, financial austerity is not a real worry because we have a sovereign currency, and we can create all the money we need to solve our problems, considering that we have such a currency. So for me, austerity is always a matter of real outcomes of the economy. For the United States, at least, it's not a matter of any financial austerity which is necessary to the government. So, with those things as a preamble, let me get into what I think the contributions or lack of contributions were for the various people in the debate. Let's begin with Amy Klobuchar. She projected her most convincing impression yet of a hardworking person who can pass laws that perhaps can marginally improve the state of the American people, but who's incapable of leading the nation to pass laws that are going to enable us to solve all of the life-threatening problems that face us at this point. She exhibits no understanding, of macroeconomics. She's a conventional faux fiscal responsibility, austerity-mongering Democrat who thinks lower deficits are more important than people. In addition, when it comes to foreign policy, she said enough to make it clear that she accepts the narrative, that Iran is a terrorist nation. And so therefore she implies that Donald Trump was right to kill the terrorist, quote unquote, commander Qasem Soleimani, and that she probably is okay with leaving our troops in the Middle East indefinitely to counter the terrorism of Iran, while of course just letting the terrorism of Saudi Arabia go entirely uncontrolled. So in sum, she has told us in this debate, as well as in others, that she's an unacceptable presidential candidate because her presidency would be another no-change presidency that would fail to do very much to solve our many great problems. So that's her, from my point of view. I don't think she had many great moments. I don't think we have to spend any more time on her. Next, we come to Tom Steyer. He projected far more imagination than Klobuchar and more motivation towards ending the climate emergency than she did. Indeed, he replied to Buttigieg by tying the Buttigieg campaign to a lack of focus on the to a lack of focus on our climate emergency. He also projected himself as more than an empty billionaire suit wearing a plaid tie. But he did nothing to show that he had the kind of comprehensive agenda that would bring us a green New Deal through a just transition. In other words, Steyer did not look ready to be president, given his obvious concern for the climate emergency problem, while he seems to still lack a clear agenda. By the way, that's one thing I've never understood about him. He started running, he spent a great deal of money on all kinds of things, and yet, last time I took a look at his website, and by then he was into the campaign 3 months. He still didn't have a clear agenda on his website. He still was playing the game of don't pin me down. My heart is good and I'm in the right place. Do not pin me down. So, nor has he shown that he is particularly well informed on the whole range of important issues facing us. He seems to be okay on environmental issues in terms of his knowledge of them, but as I said, he still doesn't have a clear agenda about what to do. He's running for president. He needs a clear agenda. He claims economic competence because he was a successful businessman, but he exhibits no particular understanding of macroeconomics and the history of, quote, successful, unquote, business people who became the president of the United States, such as Donald Trump and Herbert Hoover, is not very comforting. In fact, the very best businessman president that we have had, actually, thus far, and he was far from perfect, was Harry S. Truman. And we all remember that Harry S. Truman, before he went into the Senate and before he got into the White House, was a bankrupt. So he turned out to be pretty good as a politician, pretty poor as a businessman. Anyway, Buttigieg has delivered. Uh, I should announce, I say, I'm moving to Buttigieg now because I don't think we need to say anything more about Tom Steyer, except that he overheard, okay, what Bernie and Warren exchanged after the end of the debate in the private moment, okay, that they had. He was standing right in back of him, and he's probably heard it. Okay, I don't know if he's leaked it to anybody what they said. He seemed to be a little embarrassed by the whole moment. Anyway, Buttigieg had delivered a steady stream of empty words during the debate, and also quite a few, I'd say, lies, okay, apparent lies. And here I think you want to see some of the insights gained from Jordan Chariton's reporting on Buttigieg at Status Coup concerning how Buttigieg's black constituents actually feel about him. In sum, he seems to be a neoliberal mayor who is touting his success in renewing certain areas with luxury housing for the rich while throwing 1,000 black families out of their homes. He also seems to have a very brutal police force, which he has done very little to moderate since he became the mayor of South Bend. But anyway, going on with the what conclusions we can draw from the debate. Okay, in addition, he again failed to show that he has any macroeconomic knowledge or understanding, even though, of course, he claims to be an extremely intelligent person who went to Harvard and who worked for McKinsey when he got out. So obviously, he has to be a maven of some kind. I'm afraid, though, that he's a neoliberal maven, if he has any mavenness at all. Anyway, he again failed to show that he has any macroeconomic knowledge or understanding. He comes over as a traditional faux fiscal responsibility Democrat, an austerity monger with conventional views, who to boot supports American imperial foreign policy as far as we can tell, as far as his views are saying to us out of the debates that he has been in. He's not there for any broad reform of American foreign policy, as far as we can tell. There's also nothing in his political career or in anything he said to suggest that he will ameliorate the severe inequality in the United States, or the climate emergency, or the aggressive foreign policy of the United States. And of course, even though he said that he used to be a Medicare for All supporter, he now tells us that he's for Medicare for All for those who want it, which of course means that he's not for Medicare for all, because Medicare for All actually requires that everybody have Medicare for All so that the savings needed to have a Medicare for All program can be actually achieved. It's essential that everybody be in the program for that to happen. So that covers the lesser lights who participated in the debate. We are now down to Biden, Warren, and Bernie. In this debate, Biden surprised by speaking more often than before without having any notable disasters. And many people think that was a win for him. But they, I believe, have failed to consider the content that he delivered. When it came to that content, he had nothing persuasive to say about his plans to enhance Obamacare and why the public option kind of legislation that he favors would save the rotten, corrupt healthcare system that has been victimizing so many long-suffering Americans. On trade, the mayor basically proposed, Joe Biden basically proposed that he was going to negotiate TPP-style trade treaties, but with, quote, enforcement, unquote, of labor and environmental provisions. But he did not indicate how the enforcement provisions would or could be enforced. Remember, there were labor and environmental provisions theoretically that were in NAFTA, and that were in the original TPP, okay, and in many other trade agreements which were negotiated by the United States. But there were never any enforcement provisions that were effective. There was no way for labor to get its rights. There was no way for environmental groups to stop the damage that the business groups participating under the treaty were free to create. So, just how enforcement provisions would actually work is critical because in the past, such provisions had no mechanisms for enforcement. And it is not clear that the mechanisms that are in the U.S. MCA treaty that Trump is trying to get the final approval for, in which it looks like he's going to get it from the Democrats, who are going to roll over and play dead, okay, on this one again. There are enforcement provisions in the USMCA, but again, there is no idea, no description, no outline of how these provisions would or could be enforced. At this point, the enforcement is wholly theoretical, and we have no idea how it's going to work. If it doesn't work, then again, we won't have any labor and environmental provisions. They will be dead letters. There's nothing in it also that addresses the climate emergency. This is critical because in the past, such provisions had no mechanisms for enforcement. To say that again. On macroeconomics, Joe Biden had nothing to offer except for reducing deficits and, of course, entitlement cuts. Now, these days, he tends to downplay the entitlement cuts, but of course, there's video after video after video of him loudly extolling the necessity and the importance of entitlement cuts. Okay, so Barney often asks, he never says what he's going to do for the American people. Well, actually, he's pretty much said he's going to reduce our deficits, creating fiscal austerity for us, and he's going to have entitlement cuts. He said that again and again over many, many years. There's no reason to believe that he believes anything else now. Of course, many people have learned that the austerity that was practiced in the Obama period wasn't really necessary. That it wasn't really necessary. But Joe Biden doesn't seem to have learned those particular lessons. He seems to be wedded to the gospel of the past. On macroeconomics, he has nothing to offer except, again, I'm repeating myself, so excuse me, please. What Joe Biden has must be catching. And the last thing we need in any case is a return to austerity politics, okay, and economics. When it comes to foreign policy, Joe Biden proposed no significant changes from the Obama foreign policy. So leaving our troops in the Middle East forever and leaving us forever to support the Saudi dictatorship, the bombing, okay, in Yemen, the escalating up, okay, of tensions with Iran, which of course would be very hard to avoid. I know that Obama tried to de-escalate those, and I'm sure Biden will also try to de-escalate them. But if the United States does not manage to disengage from the Wahhabists and from the Saudis and from the Israelis sufficiently to give the Iranians a fair deal and to give the Palestinians a fair deal, it will never be the case that we will be able to completely de escalate the tensions with Iran, because those tensions are based on those alliances and our partiality to those particular states that, of course, are entirely opposed to leaving Iran in peace. On climate change, Joe Biden proposes no solutions. You have to look at his website to see this. He claims, of course, concern over the environment, but he proposes no solutions that might work before rising concentrations of greenhouse gases, but bake in enough climate change to doom us all. And by the way, in this matter, he's no different from any of the other candidates except for Bernie Sanders. So, from my point of view, he lost this particular debate on all these grounds. The content of what he had to say is all about going back to Obama. If we go back to Obama world, we cannot survive. We will not survive. People will never have a Medicare for All program. They'll never have a transition which is just. Inequality will keep on growing. Our democracy will be destroyed. This is what Joe Biden is telling us. If we read between the lines of what he is saying, this is what he is really saying. This is the meaning behind his words. Sometimes he sounds good. Sometimes he sounds kind. Sometimes he doesn't sound like a vicious fellow. But what he has in store for us is more austerity, more failure, more desperation. And his debate performance never gives us any reasons to doubt that. Now we come to Elizabeth Warren. I think she was unimpressive on the issues in the debate. She added little, if anything, of substance to the previous positions she has taken. She didn't spend much time on policies that she has already talked about. She didn't do much to tell us why those policies would work. On the new issue of the claim that Bernie Sanders told her that a woman could not win, we all know, and almost everybody has said overnight and today, that such a charge is completely inconsistent with the previously stated views of Bernie Sanders over more than 30 years, since 1987 at least, and is an obvious smear. Nor did she say precisely that Bernie said that he actually said that a woman could not win. She never said exactly what Bernie did say to persuade her that he meant that. In other words, she doubled down on the smear her campaign originated and that was carried forward by CNN. And she did that in a very disingenuous way. And as Nico House, has pointed out, during the debate, while she looked down, as she said that, when Abby Phillip asked her the question of what she said when Bernie said to her that it was not possible for a woman to win the campaign. She kind of she looked down and she paused and she said she disagreed. And that's all she wanted to talk about. That was, of course, highly dishonest, highly disingenuous. In that smear, she was aided and abetted by Abby Phillip of CNN. Phillip outrageously asked Warren how she reacted to Bernie's telling her that a woman could not win right after Bernie denied that he said that. In fact, he denied it twice. So, in effect, Abby Phillip, the moderator, called Bernie a liar to his face by framing her question in that way. And she did not even acknowledge, that is, neither Warren nor Phillip acknowledged that the disagreement that Bernie evidently has with Warren could have been a matter of interpretation or misunderstanding. Look, it's really clear that the moderators of these debates need to stop putting their filthy thumbs on the scales in this primary context. Nobody elected them to make the choices in the primaries for us. Those choices should be our choices, not the choice of the media personalities like Abby Phillip. I mean, what gives them the right? What gives her the right? Obviously, they think their ownership of CNN gives them the right. Well, I got news for them. CNN is a licensed mass media organization, and that license can be pulled. And they're giving us plenty of reason to advocate for pulling it and licensing somebody else. Like TYT, for example, or anybody else. We've got to do something about moderators of debates putting their thumbs on the scale in these primary debates. That is not their role in our society. There's no way it should be their role in our society. This is propaganda of the highest order. And we don't need it. In fact, not only don't we need it, we cannot live with it. It's antithetical to democracy. It undermines our democracy. And we have to stop them from doing it. The above aside, I think Bernie still won the debate. He won the content, of the debate. But he was too gentle in his rebuttal of the charge of what he had said to Warren. I think he should have turned to Warren and he should have asked her directly something in the following vein. I'm putting this in quotation marks, though of course I'm quoting myself, not him. Quote, your campaign people are characterizing me as saying to you that a woman cannot win the presidency, unquote. According to my memory of our private conversation, I said nothing of the kind. So let me ask you directly, what precisely do you recall me saying? Please give me the quote as you remember it, unquote. he would then have put Elizabeth Warren on the spot, preempted any idiotic question from Abby Phillip, and given Warren a chance to either directly lie about what Bernie said in public or dissemble in various ways. I think the result of that would have been her dissembling. I don't think she would have directly lied to his face in so many words. She probably would have said something like, well, you spoke to me about all the ways in which it would be possible for Donald Trump to undermine my campaign. And I took that to mean that you thought, okay, that a woman could not be elected. She would probably have said something like that. Okay, and Bernie could have said, well, then there has been a misunderstanding. I certainly never conveyed that in so many words, and you inferred too much. Now, having said that, though, if Elizabeth Warren had come to me at the beginning of 2016, and she had asked me whether she specifically would have been a viable candidate for the presidency, I think that I would have also outlined the various difficulties she personally would have encountered in running against the extremely rude person, of Trump. And I would have asked her to seriously consider whether her personality matched sufficiently Trump's personality so that on the campaign trail, she would be able to give as good as she got, considering that he would throw the book at her in terms of all kinds of nicknames, and obscene kinds of games that he would pull. So this is not to say, that a woman can't be elected. Of course a woman could be elected, in 2020. But it would be a particular kind of woman, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She could handle Trump with her eyes closed. Rashida Tlaib could handle Trump with her eyes closed. Ilhan Omar could handle Trump with her eyes closed. But there is a real question about whether the college professor, Elizabeth Warren, who comes from the Midwest and perhaps an Oklahoma nice type of background, would be able to handle Trump. There is a question of whether personalities match in interaction in these particular campaigns. Hillary Clinton's personality, as tough and nasty as Hillary was, did not match up well against Trump. Her toughness and her nastiness did not prevent him making her look silly again and again and again. So it's not about simply toughness and nastiness. It's about a certain ability to respond to street talk in a way that undermines the street talk. Does Warren have the background to be able to do that? Could she be trained, okay, to do that? I mean, the Democratic primary is a softball. She never has to face any street talk there, especially since she was friends with Bernie. And he was motivated to be nice and be nice and be nice and not deliver any street talk. Now, there are antidotes to street talk. I mean, look at Tulsi Gabbard. She wouldn't have any trouble. She wouldn't have any trouble matching up with Trump. I mean, I'm talking about in terms of a personality matchup. I mean, she would just simply project that very grave charisma she has and blow him out of the water big time. So take it for what it's worth. That's my opinion over the matchup. I don't know whether Bernie said anything like this to her. I'm sure that he was supportive because it's his way to be supportive, and I'm sure all he did was, while encouraging her, he probably pointed up what the real difficulties would be, as a friend would to another friend. And knowing Bernie, as I think I do from watching him for so many years, I think that's probably how he treated it. Anyway, that's what I think is behind this all, and I agree with the verdict that Warren has stabbed him in the back on this and colluded with CNN in order to do it, to make money for CNN, as well as to sabotage Bernie's chances in this campaign, and to align herself more strongly with the establishment wing of the Democratic Party. She has decided once again, to choose the establishment wing over the progressives. And she will do that every time. That's who she is. She's just a softer, gentler neoliberal. But at her core, she is a neoliberal. I mean, look at the way she was talking about healthcare reform last night. In the initial stages, she was talking about what the market would do if there was going to be a public alternative, if a public option was part of the pharmaceutical market. With her, it's markets, markets, markets. Okay, it's never just pass a law and prohibit the behavior we don't want to see, or tax it out of existence, okay, or whatever, but use the authority of the government. Don't just construct another market that these interests can easily undermine over a period of time. So she's shown us again her neoliberal core, and she's shown us again her betrayal of the progressive movement. I think that now we are done with her, and that where she is for the rest of the campaign is in a competitive contest with Amy Klobuchar and Tom Steyer and Mayor Pete and Joe Biden. And she's going to have a tough time now demonstrating that she's any different than any of them. And uh, uh, her supposed Medicare for All program, that's just BS. She'd never get it passed in the fourth year. She'd never get 2 bites at that apple. That was never going to happen. Anyway, going on, okay, to what I think was another of Bernie's failures in this. I think he failed to answer the how you're going to pay for it question as successfully as he needed to. Yeah, he was fairly successful on it, as successful as he's been in some of the other debates. But I think his framing is faulty on it. And I'm not talking about taking an MMT slant on it. I mean, of course, his framework is faulty, okay, in that way, but without a year of education on MMT and what it entails, there's no way to introduce MMT in a relatively short exposition of how you're going to pay for it, okay, and but then avoid the consequences of an overwhelming mass media campaign to make you look like an idiot. So I think that Bernie needed to approach that answer, okay, in something like the following way. And now I'm just going to outline for you 5 points that I think that Bernie should have made. Now, these 5 points are not actually too long, but they're probably longer than a moderator in a debate would give you in these particular debates. So the way it has to be prefaced is if somebody asks you how you're going to pay for it, the way you have to preface it is by saying, okay, look, how I'm going to pay for it is not really so complicated. It's actually fairly simple. But it's not something that can be boiled down into a soundbite. So you asked the question. If you want me to answer it, I've boiled it down to 5 points, and you're going to have to give me the time I need to state those 5 points, because there's no way to boil that down any further. If you really want an answer, though, I'm going to have to make those 5 points. Otherwise, I'm just going to publish the 5 points after the debate, and I'm going to ask people to go to those 5 points. Believe me, though, I can easily pay for it. And better than the current system can be paid for. Better and cheaper. That's my soundbite on it. I can pay for it better. I can pay for it cheaper. Now, if you want the 5 points, here are the 5 points. And he should get agreement from the moderator that he'll have enough time to make his 5 points without interruption. And then he should say, look, in 2019, the U.S. Estimated national health spending by CMS was $3.8 trillion. And in 2022, the first year we might have some new legislation impacting on national health care spending. That spending is projected by CMS to become $4.5 trillion per year. Point two, one way or another, That all comes out of private sector pockets, since there is no government deficit spending on healthcare programs. That is, under our current conditions, either we pay taxes, or we pay premiums, or we pay copays, or we pay deductibles in return for the health care we in the private sector get. We as individuals get. Right now, there is no free lunch for the private sector, since even when government programs pay for things, taxes are collected by the government from the private sector, okay, in equal amounts of dollars corresponding to the cost of the government programs. And of course, things not paid for by government programs, that clearly comes out of our pockets in some way. It may go to insurance companies, okay, it's middle people, or it may come directly out of our pockets, but it's out of private sector pockets. That's all there is right now in terms of how we finance it. Now, I could suggest other ways to finance it, but I'm not going to go into that here. I'm going to assume that we're going to continue those methods of financing our health care, including the Medicare for All program that I propose. Point 3, projections based on CMS about our national health care spending over 10 years beginning in 2022. That is the 10-year projections beginning in 2022 are in excess of $64.6 trillion. Now, I have to be clear that the actual CMS, actual projections by CMS were for the period 2019 through, I believe, 2027. Actually, from 2018 through to 2027. So those are the 10 years actually covered by CMS. But I took the liberty of using CMS assumptions to project further out for the 10-year period beginning in 2022, ending in 2031. And that's how I come up with a grand total of $64.6 trillion that we would spend. Okay? And this assumes that we would modify our healthcare system in some way to cover 100% of the people, though not necessarily through a Medicare for All program. In other words, this assumes we would use a public option, because point 4, those who advocate for a public option assume such a program will bring 100% coverage. I'm not going to argue that point, even though I doubt it. However, there's nothing in the PO plans at present that will bend the cost curve. So if 100% coverage is achieved, we cannot, if a public option is passed in 2021 and begins in 2022, expect to spend less than 10% more than is currently projected by CMS each year. So we have to ask people like Joe Biden and Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar and anybody else running who thinks a public option can do this. We have to ask them, quote, how are you going to pay in excess of $64.6 trillion over the 10 years beginning in 2022 and ending in 2031? And when I say, how are you going to pay for it, I don't mean any sort of government contribution to pay for part of it. You here is us in the private sector, all of us in the private sector. How are we going to pay in excess of 64.6 trillion over the 10 years beginning in 2022 and ending in 2031? Because that will be the total cost to us of your public option proposal. It's not the cost to the government of the public option proposal that counts. It's the total cost to us in the private sector over 10 years that counts. On the other hand, we know from the experience, and this is 0.5. On the other, see, we're at 0.5 already. On the other hand, we know from the experience of other nations like ourselves, such as Canada, that if we pass Medicare for All and are diligent, then we can reduce costs to 2/3 or less of the $64.6 trillion we are scheduled to pay now. That comes to about $43 trillion, based on extending the CMS assumptions and the projections that CMS has thus far put out. So, that's a savings of about $21 trillion compared to what we project we would pay now. Okay, or under a system where we had a public option, but otherwise that covered everybody, but otherwise was the same as what we have now. And by the way, the Medicare for All approach would spend an average of $4.3 trillion per year beginning in 2022, which, by the way, is $200 billion less than we would already be paying in 2022 for our current rotten system based on the CMS projections. So, that's how I'll pay for Medicare for All, simply by having us pay less than what we would pay in 2022 if we stuck with the present system or passed the public option rather than Medicare for All in 2010. I'm sorry. Rather than Medicare for All in 2021. In other words, we'd pass it in 2021, begin it in 2022. Sorry, I misspoke on that. We know we can afford that, because that is just a short-term projection of what we're paying for that kind of health care now. So, that's what I think that Bernie should have said. That's a winning reply, because it's so clear. Please, everybody, send this video to all the Bernie groups that you are members of. They need to see the explanation. They need to see the video. I'm sure Bernie can boil it down further with his staff, that he can boil it down even further than I can have boiled it down. He has said similar things in some, actually before. He knows that it's going to cost less. But he has to come out with a statement that says that in a decadal projection. And he also needs to put in a spreadsheet. Now they'll start trying to tear apart the spreadsheet and blah, 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 okay, and blah, blah, blah. But he will have an answer for the debate. And we can handle the back and forth. The economists in back of him can handle the back and forth of that particular debate. We can do that. And he can emerge from the debate with Medicare for All intact. Anyway, Overall, I think Bernie won in this debate, and the attempt by CNN and Warren to smear him backfired. It's now public knowledge that Warren leaked the charge against Bernie, and CNN ran with it to aid her in smearing him. This has motivated a furious reaction from the alternative media, which can only hurt Warren and make her persona non grata to the progressive movement, while failing to win her much support. Support among those supporting either Biden or Buttigieg or Klobuchar or Steyer for that matter. The whole stunt smacks too much of Clintonian strategy and tactics, and it was perhaps initiated by some of the previous Clinton supporters she made the mistake of hiring to staff her campaign. She brought the poison inside the Clinton and Obama staffers, who in many cases are the same. So, completely apart from the manufactured issue above, Bernie seems to have won the debate. Bernie made it clear that he would radically change our trade policy, and he was going to negotiate treaties that would protect the environment and labor and the climate. He also made it clear that he would pursue a far different and less warlike foreign policy than any other candidate. Even though Warren is supposedly for de-escalation of conflict too, based on her current but problematic relationship with the truth, we cannot trust her to stand up to the military-industrial complex. The only people we can trust to do that, perhaps, well, not perhaps, in Bernie's case, I'm sure we can trust him. And I will say perhaps we can trust but Tulsi Gabbard as well. One overriding issue raised by the debates is whether future debates should be moderated by the big corporate media companies. CNN disgraced itself last night beyond all expectations. Now, they got lots and lots of criticisms for their other debates, but they did not listen. They just doubled down. And right now, they're in total disgrace. I mean, they were even getting criticized over at MSNBC for this. Even Morning Joe was criticizing them. We were looking at extreme corporate abuse of a public trust last night. Abby Phillip, in particular, was gross in her abuse of the moderator role, openly accepting Senator Warren's version of the truth, based on no apparent evidence whatever. Certainly, presidential debates were far less biased in the framing of the questions when they were run by the League of Women Voters back in the 80s than they are now. Now, I'm not proposing we go back to the League of Women Voters permanently, but perhaps pending careful design of a new system, that might be a stopgap to get some better debates. We have to do something. What we have now is just a travesty. So, that's my main statement here for tonight. I'm going to move now to consider what you have to say on Facebook. I hope you've been sharing this. I need those shares. I think this one's important. Please like, please share, please subscribe. Before I do that, let me show my green screen here. Please share, like, and subscribe when the YouTube video goes up. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Okay, let me go back to my main view now. Okay, I'll get into the comments now. Wait a minute, let me make sure I'm back at my main view, but I'm not seeing it on my screen. Perhaps it will be there in just a minute. Susan Beaver says, only real progressives can handle Trump because they are not politicians who are fraudulent. Hey, Susan, how are you? George Scheller says, hi, Steve, and hi, George. Okay, Evelina Pont says, would that have changed Warren or Abby's attitude any? I don't know what that's a reply to, so I'm not going to comment on it. Steve Wolfbrand said, can we get 20 people on this stream? Come on, people. Steve says, hey, George. And Russell Gorman is here or has joined. And George said, I just shared. Thank you, George. And Steve Day says, could you hold off with running mate comments before the convention, please? Susan says, can't make a silk purse out of a sow's war or a sow's ear. Steve says, good man. And Susan says, sow's ear. Margot Shepard is joined. Hey, Margot, great to see you. Susan says, yes, I think she's damaged her campaign and her political career. Cora says, Tulsi definitely would put Trump in his place. I think she would, and in a lot better way than Buttigieg would. She would put him in his place with authority. That woman has got authority. And Margot says, so glad to be here. And Susan says it backfired. Kay says, I share to my page. Many are probably watching the Lev Parnas interview on Rachel. Oh, come on. He's spilling a lot of beans. Laugh out loud on the subject of Liz and Bernie. Michael Moore knows them both very well, and his podcast today was full of times that Warren has lied through a whole life. It's called Rumble. Yeah, I know about Rumble. I didn't get a chance to see that, though, today. I'll certainly check it out. I like it. Okay, and Michael Moore usually has some very good things to say. Susan says, she pulled the gender card. It's so gross. Yeah, I know. It's getting old. And Russ says, yes, she chose the establishment. Yeah, that's what she's done. She's lined up in back of the establishment again. Susan says she never mentions Medicare for All now. Yeah, because when she mentions it, she sounds so silly given what she's proposed. And Russ says she is a softer, gentler neoliberal, unquote. And, quote, she is neoliberal to the core, unquote. And Susan says Warren is an insidious fraud. Russ says, yes, I am done with her. Actually, though, we were done with her before this little stunt, weren't we, Russ? And Susan says, when people show you who they are, believe them. Steve says, does with her here. I think he meant done with her here. And Steve says, exactly. And Susan says, Steyer is 1,000 times better than Warren. Uh, so far, I haven't caught Steyer in a deliberate lie. I haven't seen him, deliberately lie. Okay, I don't agree with his opinions very much, but I don't see him playing games with his opinions, and I don't see him lying about what he thinks. I think he's a fairly honest man, but I haven't studied, his business career too much, so of course, uh, I cannot really say. I know he made his money, in hedge funds. I also know that there are crooks in that area, but you don't have to be a crook in the area. And Susan says Bernie didn't have the opportunity to specify his how to pay for it strategy. Yeah, that's true. He didn't have a sufficient amount of opportunity, but he could have pressured them in the way I suggested to give him that opportunity or STFU about their question. He doesn't have an obligation to answer the question in 20 seconds because there's not a 20-second answer. Or there is a 20-second answer. No, he can say, well, I'll pay for it in the same way we pay for things now. If they're not satisfied with that, though, which they wouldn't be satisfied with, they'd say, Bernie, are you crazy? How can we pay for it in the same way we do now? It's so much more expensive. And Bernie can say, no, it's not so much more expensive. It's so much cheaper. You're mistaken about how expensive it is. He could have gotten them down to a point where they would have had to have given him the time to explain himself. Okay, and Evelina says, why aren't you one of Bernie's advisors? Because I've never been asked to be a Bernie advisor. If I was asked to be a Bernie advisor, I'd agree in a minute. I'd love to be a Bernie advisor. But somebody close to Bernie has to suggest that maybe person X would be a good advisor. Stephanie Kelton got to be an advisor of Bernie Sanders, I believe, through Jamie Galbraith, who Bernie was relying on to get him some good advisors. So George Scheller says Susan Beaver, even though he explained it at every other debate, but they framed it like he refused to answer. Yes, so he could have said in this one, he could have said, look, I've answered that question already a dozen times. Why are you reframing it as if I have refused to answer it? I haven't refused to answer it. I've said on numerous occasions how I would pay for it. And I don't think I need to spend the time repeating myself here. Look at the other debates. You asked me that question last time, and I gave you the answer then. Did you listen? Did you pay attention? Have you got it here to quote? Why not? Susan says, he had to cover the general issue of income inequality and that every other advanced nation has it, that we pay twice what all other nations pay. Yes, he did. And he should have covered that as well. He needed enough time. The question is, what strategies can he use to force them to give him that time? What strategies can he use to shut them up if they refuse to give him that time? Steve Day says all the components of the Green New Deal are integrated to work together into economic justice and social justice and climate justice and political justice also, at least a lot of it. And Steve says, George, stick around. Doc always addresses every comment to the end. Always is a long time, Steve, but I always try. Let's put it that way. Hi, Barbara Reed. Nice to see you. And let's see. And Steve says, Evelina Pont says, should be enough to pique anybody's interest, but it doesn't. Steve Wolfbrand says, yeah, I noticed that last time. I got a kick out of that. Steve Wolfbrand says, I think Biden has early stage dementia. That, okay, is very possible, but, I'm not a doctor. Okay, I'm not able to diagnose that. If he has it, then it should be demonstrable in terms of his behavior on the campaign trail. The campaign still has a long way to go, and I think he's very likely to begin showing symptoms again as the pressure gets hotter and hotter, as it will. Steve says, that would explain Corn Pop and kids that need to have record players at night. Laugh out loud. Yeah, I know. Steve says, Epstein didn't kill himself, JS. Steve says, in fact, he's probably still alive. Okay, and Evelina says he has to convince people that it will cost less. And that's where the explanation about how everybody pays less in other nations comes into the fight. To convince people that it costs less, you have to bring them empirical data from the other nations. In other words, you have to say things like, well, you know that Americans are very much like Canadians. They're the closest nation to us on a cultural basis. And they spend less than 2/3 of what we spend on their Medicare for All system. George Shell says, I've seen a spreadsheet floating around. Not sure if it's a legitimate spreadsheet, though. There's a CMS spreadsheet downloadable from the internet. All you have to do is Google National Health Expenditures CMS projections. And you can get to a link which is going to allow you to download the CMS tables. Steve says, no more debates, Doc. Voting starts next. Well, actually, there will be more debates. The 8th debate will come, in February, but it will be after the Iowa caucuses. I believe it's before the New Hampshire primary. Maybe in about a month from now. Steve says, George Ellis says, you nailed it, Doc. She badly hurt herself. Thank you, George. Russell says, she can't be trusted for anything now. George says, I love that Tulsi leapt to to Bernie's defense. Yeah, I think that's what someone with integrity does. I think that Tulsi has a modicum, okay, of integrity. I do expect that before this campaign is over, that Tulsi is going to endorse Bernie again. I know that Kay said that she had endorsed Bernie actually, but during my live stream a couple of days ago. But I think what Tulsi had done, okay, at that time was to have tweeted in Bernie's support. And Barbara Reed says, sorry, I'm trying to outwit my scroll bar right now. I'll get there in a moment. It will unfreeze. Well, good night, Russ. Sorry to see you go. Thanks for coming. Russ is having to call it a night. I'm going back to some earlier comments. Barbara Reed asks, in a form of witness protection? That's for Epstein. Okay, and Evelina says CNN and frowns with a considerable degree of anger. Steve Wolfbrand says, me too. Rob Rivera has joined. Hello, Rob. How are you? George Scheller says, Steyer. And Rob says, hey, Yoda, hot mic video leaked of what Warren and Bernie said to each other. And she said to Bernie, quote, did you call me a liar on national TV? And Bernie said, quote, what? And Warren repeated her question, and Bernie said, no, you called me a liar. You want to talk about this? Talk to me later. The hell of a nerve gave Elizabeth to say that to him like he's the liar. She's unbelievable. A little biased towards her own position, isn't she? Cheyenne Tiara says that Nico is calling the Warren confrontation handshake on the gates. Maybe Steyer will benefit from this. That is hilarious, George. You're right. Cheyenne says, I'm a mental health therapist. Biden has clear indications of dementia. But don't forget, he's had 2 brain surgeries already. Aneurysm. Oh, I didn't realize that he's had 2 brain surgeries. Oh, geez. How did I miss that? Russ says, Joe, I'm going to call it a night. Thank you for the convo. I read that before, actually. And Steve says, now I got to click on some new comments and get them down. I'll be back up in a minute. I just unfroze. And Steve asks, Doc, is Warren's career over? And he says, guess we'll have to wait and see. I wouldn't say her career is over. I mean, she still has a lot of time to spend in the Senate. So she can go back to the Senate and she can try to heal things over a period of time. You know, she can keep her nose clean, okay, and and not lie, and support strong policies, okay, of a progressive nature, and maybe in 4 to 5 years, people will begin to trust her again. Or she can just completely go over to the establishment side and serve the donors, and then they can try to keep her in there forever. But if she does that, she may just find a challenge from her friend Ayanna Presley the next time around. Steve says, "Good night, Russell." George says, "Cheyenne Tierra, wow, that's sad and scary at the same time." It should be scary for us. And Jim Bird is joined, and George says, "I wrote Steyer because I used a pronoun and wanted to clarify who I was talking about." Well, thank you, George. And Rob gives the link to the YouTube. Hot Mike catches Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren post debate. Oh, gee, I screwed up something here. Excuse me while I unsnarl some stuff. Okay, I think I'm back. George says, "I think Steyer." Wait a minute. And Nancy Blackmar's joined. Hi, Nancy. And George says, "I think Steyer screwed the pooch when he got the question about his fossil fuel dealings." Well, he may have, but he said that he's divested himself of all of his holdings. So we have to check on that and see whether he lied or not. Cheyenne says, "Same with Hillary. Bad fall. TBI. Traumatic brain injury during her campaign." Cheyenne, a few years back, I guess it must have been I think it was in 2013. I hit my head on the roof of my car and I developed a subdural hematoma. They called in a neurosurgeon, and I had also surgery to my head. The blood leak evidently never got to my brain. At least that was the diagnosis at the time, and I think, okay, it was an accurate one. And as far as I've been able to tell, I haven't had, okay, any ill effects. I function just as well now as I did then. The way I knew that there was nothing wrong with me was that when I woke up from the surgery in 2010, they immediately called an occupational therapist in. And she had become an occupational therapist after she had worked for one of the big 5 consulting firms and did not like that line of work. When I heard that from her in conversation, I promptly gave her a lecture, okay, on MMT. And at the end of the lecture, she said, "Well, I guess there's nothing wrong with your brain." So that's my brain surgery story. It wasn't actually brain surgery. It was subdural hematoma surgery. It never did get to my brain, I guess. Just got to my brain case. George says she'll cave to the donors. And Kay says, well, I'm a tired old bag, so I'm out of here for tonight. Sorry to hear it, Kay. Laugh out loud. Warren lies a lot from what I have learned. Have a peaceful night and we'll talk soon. Good chat, Joe. Thank you, Kay. Thank you for coming. Steve says, we love you, Kay. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams indeed, Kay. And Kay says, so sweet. Steve, love you. Cheyenne says, you're very clear-minded, Joe. Well, thank you, Cheyenne. I try to be. I learned long ago it takes concentration. Lana says, George says, head injuries are no joke. I have had my fair share. I hope. I hope you won't be getting any more. Lana says, you charmed her with your encyclopedic memory. Cheyenne says, oh, exactly, me too. I think my encyclopedic, my encyclopedic memory is beginning to develop a few senior moments. I don't think that has had anything to do with the brain surgery, but I find myself occasionally starting to look up some names. Whenever I forget something, though, I promptly refresh my memory. And of course, it helps to do these live streams. Okay, because I'm active every day. Either I'm live streaming, okay, or I'm writing. I'm always doing something, using my brain. And I don't think I'm in too bad shape now, quite yet, either. And Bonnie and I really discipline ourselves with our diet. Cheyenne says, exactly, me too. Yep, I think that's the way to stay alive. And I love staying alive. Any other questions or comments? I'll lean back a bit while I wait for them. Oh, I should say a couple of more things. And Cheyenne said, the poisoning caused me brain damage also. I can't spell anymore. Oh, wow, Cheyenne. I'm really sorry to hear that. Margot says, you're the best. But thanks for a great chat. And thank you, Margot, for coming. And thank you for the compliment. Steve says, Joe's brain is like a crystal. I personally can't remember what I had for breakfast. And you're very young, Steve, aren't you? And Lana says, but do you think we can teach Steyer MMT? If he wants to learn, I can teach him the basics, of MMT in one day. Doesn't take that long to know more than 99% of the other politicians out there. George Scheller says, Cheyenne Tierra, your spelling is impeccable. I've noticed that, Cheyenne. Your spelling is impeccable. It is absolutely impeccable. And your composition's pretty good, too. And George says, you're... So, I wanted to say, a couple other things. Warren said, since her statements on stage, she's taken a hard position that she's not going to talk about. She has no interest in talking about this further. So she probably figured she undermined herself and Bernie enough that there was no percentage in doing this any further. Anyway, there's an article about this I linked to that was in Common Dreams. Okay. In addition, there's another article in Common Dreams that says that CNN is truly a terrible influence on this country. That was written by Jessica Corbett, and she summarizes some of the reactions to the performance of CNN. And the article covers such things as the lengthy discussion on foreign policy and war, but without asking the candidates about the costs of that, while of course asking them about the costs of implementing Medicare for all. That caused a great reaction from the progressives. That's lots and lots of condemnation. Furthermore, the Rolling Stone writers called the moderator's questions mystifyingly inane, quote unquote. And HuffPost's Zach Carter called them awful. That was in a piece that was titled CNN Completely Botched the Democrat Presidential Debate. According to him, the debate on the whole was tedious, interminable, was frivolous, a fiasco of irrelevance, held 3 weeks before the Iowa caucuses. I don't think it was irrelevant, though, because it really exposed Warren as a very bad liar and brought it home to many, many, many people that she is that. Anyway, Carter said all kinds of things about the debate. And there's a tweet from Elie Mystal, of The Nation, who writes often, in The Nation. He says, Jesus Christ, I hate these biased questions from the moderators. How would you keep your plan from bankrupting the country, quote unquote? Just ask the Koch brothers to moderate them the next time. And Katie Halper says, these at CNN commentators are appalling. She said this on Twitter. They're making it sound like Sanders created a false controversy over the foreign policy differences between him and Biden, as if it's not actually an existential distinction between the two of them. Katie Halper is great, by the way. And also Nina Turner says, at CNN, this question framing is interesting. And then she puts up some graphics of the question framing. Question. Warren supports a new trade deal with Mexico and Canada. Why is it Sanders' opposition to it is wrong? Sanders' opposition to it is not wrong. His opposition to it is based on the idea that if it's passed now, it will be years before we can take up a new trade deal again. And that this trade deal is not sufficiently good to have to wait for years to take up a new trade deal again. Sanders is right. And the example for why Sanders is right with respect to this is healthcare itself. In 2010, the Democrats passed the lousy ACA bill, which has had only a marginal effect on our healthcare problems. But because that bill was passed, it took the pressure off healthcare reform legislation. And we're just getting back to it now 10 years later. 10 years went down the drain when Medicare for All should have been passed in 2009. Are you aware of how many hundreds of thousands of people have died since then because of that particular failure? Sanders' opposition to it is right on the money. It is not wrong. Question. Sanders' proposals would double federal spending over a decade. How will he avoid bankrupting the country? Because, you idiots, the federal government cannot go bankrupt. And he wouldn't have to bankrupt the country because his proposals would not necessarily involve a doubling, okay, of federal spending. Right now, they do not involve a doubling, okay, of federal spending. But if they do, the country can handle it through an enlarged and growing economy, and also through draining off excess reserves by taxing the wealthy a hell of a lot more. And another question, does Sanders owe voters an explanation of how much his health care will cost them and the country? He's already given them a pretty good explanation. A better explanation than the people fighting the wars have given of how they will fund those wars going into the future, and a better explanation than they have given of how they will fund the astronomical cost of health care under their plans. The 64.6 trillion over 10 years. They have no explanation at all of how we're going to pay for that. The only way to pay for that is by kicking people off of health care and having millions and millions of people die because they have no health care and can't afford to pay for it. And there's more of this. I won't go over that any further. But I commend that article on Common Dreams to you. I have linked to it. It's a fun article to read. Back to your comments. And George says, apparently mine isn't. It was just a typo, George. Your spelling may be impeccable. I haven't seen anything wrong with your spelling yet. Maybe I haven't been noticing. Okay, Evelina laughs, and Lana says CNN is right now headlining that Warren accuses Bernie of calling her a liar. And George Sellis says the CNN went way too far. They certainly did. Everybody's gone way too far. Cheyenne says, bye, everyone. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams yourself, Cheyenne. Have a great night. Steve says, night, night. Sleep well. Love. Cheyenne says, oh, you didn't know me before I got so sick. Really bad memory impairment, too. George says, love, Katie and Nina. Me too. And Steve says, Doc, do you know Susie Dawson? She's in exile, okay, in Moscow. Yes. I think, isn't she with Snowden? I'm not saying that she's she's with Snowden. I'm not sure that she's his wife, but I think she's a compatriot of Snowden who's in exile, okay, in Moscow. George Sheffer says, so true. And George and Steve says exactly. Let the 1% uh, pay for that share. George says it's Katie, isn't it? Dan. Yeah, Katie, help her. And George Joe says Steve Wolfbrand. Shit. And laugh out loud. Yeah, indeed. Okay, any more comments or questions? If not, I'm going to call it a night. I'll be back here tomorrow with lots of other good stuff. I'll be back here tomorrow uh, at 9 p.m. roughly, between 9 and 9:30. So tonight I got back to 9 p.m. again. That's a good sign. George says too many bad spelling jokes. And on that note, I'm going to say good night.